When we think of like the big names of classic horror, we usually think of the names Bela Lugosi or Boris Karloff, Lon Chaney, all of those guys that would end up playing the eponymous monsters in their own stories. And like they're good and all. They stand the test of time for a reason. They are iconic in their portrayals of these monsters that either have basis in literature or something that the studios just cooked up in order to like create this universe, kinda. Although it really wasn't a universe until they decided to have Abbott Costello meet everybody, and then everybody started crossing over with everybody, and it was just a big old fun farcy time. But while Karloff and Lugosi are the more recognizable names, there are a few bit and supporting players that in their own right should be recognized. And unless you are like a horror movie aficionado, you might not know the name Dwight Frye, because a lot like that voice in my head that tells me I should be more fiscally responsible and then I kind of just push it away, he's kind of faded into the background of like the larger, flashier parts of those stories. Dwight Frye was born in Salinas, Kansas in 1899 and would not live to see the 1950s, but in between that time, he gave us a rather iconic lineup of characters that are still enjoyed to this day. And we're gonna talk about a few of them, mostly the ones in relation to his involvement in the classic Universal monster pictures. But before we get into that, I want to say hello to any new viewers, hello any old subscribers, welcome to my Hodgepodge YouTube channel, where I talk about anything and everything that I find interesting. I want to say a huge thank you to everybody that got me to 2,200 subscribers literally the day of the James Dean videos upload. Thank you so much. I can't believe there are that many people watching me at this moment. I think that's pretty cool. Anything can really happen on this channel. I have a few books that I want to talk about. I have part 2 of the James Dean retrospective that I am in the throes of finding all of the movies for, and there are just like other topics that I want to cover, just whatever flies into my menial little brain there. But if you have any topic suggestions, feel free to drop them into the comments below. I will read them. I will heart your comment. I will respond to it as well. I really appreciate the feedback and whatnot. So, with that said, let's get back to the musings. So, like I said before, we are mostly going to be looking at Dwight Frye's participation in the classic Universal monster movies, and those include Dracula, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, Son of Frankenstein, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. A lot of Frankenstein involvement. But then we're also going to be looking at another musical comedy starring James Cagney called Something to Sing About, where he has a supporting role in that I thought was worth noting. I also will say that his filmography is much lengthier than just these Universal monster movies. He had like a lot of silent film presence before talkies came about, and then even then, after talkies, he had a big presence in Hollywood, albeit small and kind of obscure, but like his body of work is impressive. This era of his career, the one that we're going to be looking at, is very categorized by villainous, mentally unstable characters, which is not what he was known for in his silent movies. He was much more known for playing light comedic fare before Dracula came along and changed everything.
Wise man.
In Dracula, he plays Renfield, the character that is sent to Transylvania in order to have Count Dracula sign all of his proper realty papers to move to England and take over. This is maybe a hot take, maybe not, almost 100-year-old hot take, 90-year-old hot take. This Dracula adaptation is a mess. The best Dracula adaptation is Nosferatu. I don't think that's very controversial. I only say that this Dracula adaptation is kind of messy because they switched up all of the names and they cut a lot to make it into like an 80-minute thing, and I think they ended up glossing over a lot of the important things and made the immediate links to like from novel to movie a bit muddy, because Dwight Frye's character in the book is named Jonathan Harker, and then Renfield is another character, but we now know Dwight Frye as Renfield in the popular consciousness. But anyway, this character, this performance, it is delightfully unhinged. We don't get to focus a lot on what he's like before Count Dracula ends up changing him into one of his minions, but we get a lot of his crazy tendencies afterward.
He came and stood below my window in the moonlight, and he promised me things, not in words, but by doing them.
Really not to get into like a whole like Dracula movie analysis, because this is about Dwight Frye. This is not about Dracula. But I think this particular adaptation misses out on a lot of what the status quo of everything is before things start changing. The most interesting characters are Renfield and Dracula, because they are on the bad side and they're the only ones that went through like these horrific things before they went over to England. And there's really not a lot of suspense and buildup in like the first third of this movie, whereas in the novel, when Jonathan Harker goes to meet Count Dracula, that takes up a good almost half of the book. And then another half is Mina getting all of these blood transfusions, and it's kind of boring. But I digress. I would definitely characterize Dwight Frye's acting in this as unhinged, as I said earlier, but also a bit melodramatic, but I think that's okay given the material. This is a guy who is literally playing second banana to one of the flashier portrayals, one of the more iconic movie monsters, so I think it's okay to be a bit more over the top in order to cement your place in the movie. It just sucks that this also begins the tradition of him dying. Like a lot. Because he also ends up dying in the next picture, also released in 1931, Frankenstein. Something worth noting, the Fritz character that Dwight Frye plays is nowhere to be found in the novel. It was something invented entirely by the studio in order to make sure that Henry Frankenstein, Henry in this version. Again, they switched the names and made things kind of more complicated than they needed to in the adaptation process. But in order to alleviate a lot of Henry Frankenstein's own doings, to make sure that some of the grosser, grungier things could be heaped onto his little lab assistant, Fritz. But this particular part cannot be understated in terms of what it did for the Frankenstein lore and mythology going forward. All previous Frankenstein adaptations did not have a little lab assistant, but almost every single one after did. And without Dwight Frye's influence in this particular part, we would not have the iconic Marty Feldman as Igor in Young Frankenstein, or that animated Igor movie all about, you know, giving girl boss tendencies to the lab assistant. Or we would not even have Riff Raff in Rocky Horror. So we can thank Dwight Frye for Richard O'Brien dreaming up that idea. Again, this is another movie that he ends up dead at the end of, almost halfway through, after he taunts Frankenstein with fire, and then he just somehow ends up in a noose and he's dead. But you really feel like there's a loss there. Like, the person who Henry has given the task of controlling this monster is gone. So if Fritz is dead and Henry has like other things to attend to, then who's watching the monster? Moving right along, we go to the sequel to Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein. Dwight Frye does not have much of a part in this. He plays another lab assistant named Carl, who also ends up being dead at the end after Frankenstein hurls him off a building. The production history of Bride of Frankenstein is very interesting because it not only kind of loosely adapts the last 2/3 of the Frankenstein book, but it also went through a lot of production meddling in the editing room. I think I've mentioned this before in another video, but a lot of the initial prologue where Mary Shelley is like doing like the writing contest had to be trimmed down because a lot of the décolletage around Elsa Lanchester's chest was a little too racy for people at the time, so they had to cut it down. And then apparently Dwight Frye had a much larger part throughout all of it, but his parts ended up getting cut, either because the movie was too long, or they were too graphic, or it ended up being too like philosophical. The Frankenstein movies do have a lot of unfortunate implications when it comes to denying the monster his humanity. In the book, the monster eventually learns to speak and read and write and express ideas for himself, and he wants companionship. He just does not want to be lonely. Relatable content. But in the movie versions, he is robbed of that personal growth in order to create this greater black and white dichotomy between monster, man, villain, hero, whatever. Because even though the blasphemous Henry Frankenstein is able to play God in his own story and say as such,
"In the name of God, now I know what it feels like to be God,"
it's not his innocent creation that ends up living in the end. He ends up dying in the end. And given how much people were against blasphemy and like declaring that they were God back in the 1930s, it's amazing just looking back at it and being what they decided they had to censor and stuff that they knew they had to follow. I know we're not going quite chronologically. The Invisible Man is next, but we are going to be looking at Something to Sing About instead and just kind of flip these around. So in Something to Sing About, Dwight Frye plays a catty gay a catty gay makeup guy who is tasked with helping make over James Cagney into a much more iconic and relatable Hollywood figure. Out of like all of the performances that I've seen, this is like the only comedic one, and well, kind of sad that we had to make the gay people like the butt of the joke, but it's fine. He's not stated to be gay. We can infer that he is, but it's fine. We can forgive it, especially with how decently it comes across at moments.
So easily said.
But then there are other moments where I'm just like, wow, you really just said it like that. Wow, best Jen, huh? This movie is cute and fun, and it was nominated for an Oscar for, I think, best music. I think it was song score. James Cagney's dancing and singing are also very good, something that he wished he had done more of throughout his career. And fun fact, this was also one of the last movies he watched before his death because he just appreciated it so much. This is a total and tonal departure from the rest of the monster movies that made up a bulk of Dwight Frye's filmography, but his performance in this, I think, is worth noting because it harkens back to his earlier comedic roles that were the ones that initially got him noticed by all these filmmakers, all these directors and studio heads. So now, unfortunately, Dwight Frye kind of peaked right at the beginning of his talkie career because he had like 3 or 4 iconic roles right in a row, and then he kind of just dropped off. In The Invisible Man, Dwight Frye is nowhere to be seen until about almost 2/3 of the way through, where he plays a reporter with like 2 lines, and you're like, oh, you used to do things. Okay. The same can also be said about the last 2 things that we're just kind of look at, Ghost of Frankenstein and Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. There is some slight conjecture about whether or not Dwight Frye is actually in Ghost of Frankenstein, because while his IMDb lists him as being one of the villagers in the movie, there are no clear ways of telling because he is not credited in the end credits, and going through all of the footage is very hard because almost none of the villagers are well lit, and because it's crowd scenes, it's harder to discern who is where, especially if you're like in the back somewhere, or like carrying some fire like really close to your face. It's just conjecture. In Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, Dwight Frye plays the character of Rudy, who is kind of a non-entity, and basically it's just like, did the doctor find the monster yet? Are we gonna go kill him? And then everybody's like, yeah, I guess. He just basically, he's kind of like an exposition fairy and kind of just like a help to stitch some of the grander scenes together. So, out with a bang. Oh my god. Okay, no, I totally forgot about this one. This is probably like maybe outside of those cameos that I was just talking about, is probably his best, meatiest role in 1933's The Vampire Bat, where he plays Herman Glebe, a mentally challenged man who is accused of being the vampire who was sucking the life out of everybody in arm's reach. But the only reason they end up accusing him is because he likes to catch bats because they're soft, and then he just like puts them in his like coat pockets, and they're just like, he's so fascinated with bats, he might be the vampire bat.
There. Now. Soft. Nice. There.
But then obviously it turns out that it's not him. Ugh. This one has a very fascinating production history because it was made to basically piggyback off the success of other more established actors and was made really, really, really cheaply and rushed out before another movie starring, oh my gosh, who was it? Oh, Frye and Melvin Douglas could come out. And so they beat that one to the punch, they beat that one to the box office, and it made a little bit of money because of those two actors' notoriety. And I'm not really going to get into the discussion of Frye's portrayal of mental illness here because I don't think it's pertinent. And in that way, I want to say that it's more a relic of its time than an accurate portrayal of mental illness as we know it today. But in a way, it's not too different from what he did as Renfield, though I think those are the two performances that we can definitely compare the most, just because of their just almost obsessive devotion to this thing that they both really, really like. Oh my god, no, in the movie he plays a hairdresser. In Something to Sing About, he plays a hairdresser. I'm gonna have a hard time editing that. No, I don't have to. It's an amendment here. So I think all in all, despite Dwight Frye's initial versatility when he started on early Broadway and in silent pictures, he was kind of pigeonholed into a certain type of character, which a lot of people have categorized as loyal henchman. And while this particular look at parts of his career is very homogenous, especially leaning towards that loyal henchman archetype, there are plenty of other projects that have Dwight Frye in them that I will link below, that if you can end up finding him and spotting him in the crowd, you can be like, oh yeah, that's pretty cool. But if you want something different out of Dwight Frye, I definitely recommend finding some of his silent films, some of his pre-Dracula work, as well as even finding Something to Sing About. That one is free here on YouTube. Granted, they're not great prints because it's in the public domain, but what can you do? We have a lot of his work preserved for a reason, and I think it's because his presence was worth standing the test of time. Alright everybody, that is going to do it for this video. I want to thank you all again for coming here, showing up. If you liked this video, please give it a like, a thumbs up if you will, and hit that subscription notification, hit the bell if you always want to find out when I'm uploading a new video, which is about every 2-ish weeks these days. The Serial Monsters video is in the throes of being made, and I am just still searching for those James Dean movies. So, go out there, stay sexy.